Hey there, my name is Katie Morgan. I am an indie fantasy author, editor, and longtime anime fan, and welcome to Let's Write With, the series where we use the power of anime to become better writers. If you're tired of writing advice that doesn't do much other than give you a bulleted list of generic tips, you're in the right place. In this series, we take a more organic approach by looking at what other writers are doing, stealing their good ideas, and hopefully figuring out how to avoid their mistakes. Today we're going to do that by talking about an anime called Zenshu. But first, just a heads up that there will be spoilers, and that includes spoilers for the end of the series. But don't worry, I'll give you a heads up when we get there, and a timestamp you can jump to if you don't mind spoilers in general, but you'd like to avoid that one. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's talk story. Zenshu is the story of Natsuko, an up-and-coming animator who's just put out her first big hit and is gearing up for the next one. Unfortunately, Natsuko doesn't play well with others, and even worse, she has no idea how to animate her next movie, which is about first love, because she's never experienced first love herself. One day, with the deadline looming, Natsuko chokes on her expired lunch and passes out? It's a little unclear. What is clear is that when she wakes up, she finds herself inexplicably trapped inside the world of A Tale of Perishing, the anime movie she loved as a kid and that inspired her to become an animator. At first, Natsuko thinks this is just a bizarro dream, but then she meets some of the 9 soldiers, the characters she's obsessed over for years, and learns that they are, at least here, very real people with a very real problem. They're running out of time to save their home from the voids, dark creatures whose ultimate goal is to destroy the world. Natsuko has seen this movie a million times, so she knows how it ends. Not well, as the title suggests. But her new friends are in the dark about their fate. And when she discovers that she has a power that could turn the tides, she has to decide if changing the story is even possible. Oh, and to make matters even more complicated, she might have accidentally locked in that first love thing, which is a shame since it's looking an awful lot like the doomed hero of A Tale of Perishing can't be undoomed. In this video, we're going to look at 3 story elements and try to pick apart how they're working or not working and what we can take away to help with our own writing. The elements we're going to address are meta, themes, and endings. Meta. Okay, so when I say meta, I am not talking about the tech company. By meta, I mean metafiction, which is a way of telling a story that doesn't try to hide the fact that you're telling a story. For example, an author might make particularly self-aware dialogue or world-building choices that basically give you the sense that the characters know they're in a story and have particular expectations for how it might turn out. Or the author might just make references to something really relevant to the reader, kind of like a shared inside joke. To be honest, I'm kind of conflating the idea of metafiction with metatextuality, the idea that a story is making comments about itself or the genre or similar stories. Taken all together, this is a major part of the story structure of Zenshu, and you're probably going to either love or hate it depending on your history with watching anime. When it comes to meta, Zenshu has 2 approaches. For fans. On the surface, Zenshu has a pretty simple plot. MC gets transported to another world where her super special powers become the key to saving the day. So pretty much like every other isekai anime. But the meta component makes things a little bit more unusual. Because this isn't just a story about an animator trapped in an anime, it's also about a creator who rediscovers her love of creating by becoming part of the story that she loves. And Zenshu does this by reminding viewers of why they love the stories they love. Zenshu is full of references to other anime, all designed to dredge up your nostalgia and get you feeling as much of a connection to the art form as Natsuko does. To name just a few examples, Natsuko's first big hit stars a Sailor Moon-like character who is actually voiced by Kotono Mitsuishi, the original voice actor for Sailor Moon. In addition to similar looks, the character has a transformation sequence that looks very much like Sailor Moon's. And Natsuko's own power, which allows her to bring her drawings to life, also involves a repeated animated sequence before each attack, a staple of magical girl shoujo. Soon after arriving in A Tale of Perishing, Natsuko describes her situation as being like an isekai anime and wishes she watched more of the genre so she'd know how to get back to the real world. This is one of many genre-savvy comments she makes throughout the series. In episode 5, when Natsuko has gotten overly confident about her powers and started striking silly poses after defeating voids, Resident snarky unicorn Yunio makes fun of her and doesn't seem particularly impressed when she explains that these poses are important now that they're basically in a Sentai anime. Think shows like Power Rangers, where the heroes wear flashy colors and pose a lot. And that's just scratching the surface. Every time Natsuko uses her drawing ability to solve problems during battle, she comes up with a new character that's clearly meant to represent classic anime designs and movements. You could also argue that there are some non-anime references too. Luke Braveheart, Natsuko's love interest and leader of the Nine Soldiers, looks an awful lot like Link, the hero of the Legend of Zelda games. In the flashback where Natsuko approaches several schoolgirls to learn more about their first loves, her hair and the lighting are reminiscent of the angry spirit from The Ring. And Zenshu's big bad, aka the Ultimate Void, has some similarities to Chernobog from Fantasia. I suppose some of these references might be a stretch on my part, but I think it's clear that Zenshu knows it's a story for people who love stories. And it goes out of its way to send little winks and nudges to remind the audience of what we grew up loving. So if you're an anime geek, this is a total delight. But what if you're not? Here's where targeting your audience with meta can fall flat, because not everyone has the same reference points. If you didn't spend your childhood watching Sailor Moon and Gundam, you might not care that Natsuko's drawings are similar to those. Also, not everyone's into that self-referential, tongue-in-cheek kind of stuff, so they may not care even if they do get the reference. Using meta can also take your audience out of the story. After all, you're reminding them that they're experiencing a story rather than immersing them in it. This isn't a reason to not use meta at all. It just means that your story may not appeal to everyone, but that's probably true no matter what you do. For creatives. Zenshu also uses meta to appeal specifically to creatives. The most obvious example of this is the fact that Natsuko is an animator, and the show was created by an animation studio called MAPPA. For those who are unaware, MAPPA is the studio behind some of the most wildly successful anime of recent years, including Attack on Titan, Jujutsu Kaisen, and Chainsaw Man. MAPPA has also been the subject of numerous controversies surrounding low pay and abusive work conditions. So when this studio creates an anime about an overworked animator who basically dies in the first episode, it's kind of hard not to draw some meta conclusions about the animation industry. I do think the show kind of shies away from committing to this idea, but it is part of the setup and therefore I think worth mentioning. There's also the broader context of artists reflecting on the importance of art. Because it's Natsuko's gift for drawing that enables her to help her friends during the climactic battles in each episode. She literally hears a voice telling her to draw, and then sits down and creates something on the spot that helps win the fight. The other characters might call it magic, but we know it's all about creativity and skill, which I guess is a kind of magic. But Natsuko's skill is also a source of a lot of angst over the course of the series. Sure, her drawings can help protect the last remaining soul future, the only thing standing in the way of the end of the world, but she has to come up with something new to draw for every battle. And in episode 9, we learn that her creations can be copied by the Voids to create even more deadly enemies. This leads Natsuko into a downward spiral as she becomes completely unable to use her power because she's so afraid of giving the Voids a new weapon. And when she and Yunio are trapped inside a void toward the end of the series, we see how that fear of creation manifests itself. Natsuko has visions of being ridiculed and hated in the real world to the point where she decides to give up drawing altogether. The meta here is the nod to the fact that we've all probably felt this way when we're trying to create something. Like, the thing that we love to create is also our worst enemy. Like, we're doomed to failure. And the pressure of always having to create something new and always having to do better than the last thing you created is pretty relatable for creatives, myself included. It also speaks to the importance of having someone believe in you and your work, the way Yunio believes in Natsuko and brings her back from the brink of despair. I think this approach to meta is something that sets Zenshu apart from a lot of anime, despite some of the other familiar story elements. The show relies on the assumption that its audience loves animation the same way that its protagonist does. So even if the story itself isn't groundbreaking, the meta adds an interesting additional level to the narrative. Writing takeaways on meta. 1. Creating your story within the metafiction structure, in other words, writing a story that knows it's a story, can be a really interesting way to engage with your audience. It's like you're actively encouraging them to bring their own experiences to the table and build the story with you. 2. Of course, that structure isn't going to work for everyone. Using lots of meta references and in-jokes can turn off people who either aren't familiar with whatever you're referencing, or just prefer stories that don't keep reminding them that they're watching or reading a story. 3. In the end, incorporating meta can be a fun approach to take, a way of deepening the story. But you do run the risk of losing some of your audience, especially if you start getting too pleased with yourself and all of your references. So if you're interested in playing with it, it's important to make conscious choices about how you're going to use it and what you hope to get out of structuring your story this way. Themes. Some of the themes that Zenshu explores are pretty typical of this kind of story. First and foremost, you've got your protagonist undergoing personal growth and coming to understand the importance of letting other people into her life. But this is combined with some interesting approaches to themes like fate and the question of whether or not you can actually fix things. Teamwork. When we meet Natsuko, she's standoffish and determined to do all of the work on her next big movie by herself, much to the annoyance of the rest of her coworkers. She's also clearly a closed-off kind of person, literally hiding behind her hair and rarely showing what she's truly thinking or feeling. This bleeds over into the way Natsuko initially treats the 9 soldiers in A Tale of Perishing, too. For a little context, the 9 soldiers are actually down to just the 4 Natsuko meets when she first enters A Tale of Perishing. All of the others have died fighting the Voids, with the exception of one, a disgraced member named Justice, who pops up in episode 5. The 9 soldiers' job is to prevent the Voids from destroying each town's soul future and thereby ending the world. Given that 4 of the heroes are dead and only 1 soul future remains, you can probably guess how well that's going. Unlike Natsuko, the 9 soldiers have spent their entire lives learning how to work together and play to each other's strengths. While Luke is their leader, Yunio is capable of holding his own with his unicorn powers, and the elf Memorin offers up a tough second front with her magical arrows. And everyone relies on the robot QJ to tell them when the next void attack is going to hit. Natsuko throws a wrench into all of this. She doesn't understand her own power at first, which involves using an inexplicably magical pegbar to bring her drawings to life. And once Natsuko does understand how it works, she decides to take matters into her own hands rather than work as a team, just like she always does. Things come to a head starting in episode 5, when, for the first time, Natsuko's power doesn't work against the Voids. Although she's shaken at first, she's prepared to keep fighting on her own, which ticks off Luke, who points out that she nearly died. Natsuko doesn't know what to do with this concern, and it makes her start to question her refusal to rely on others. When Natsuko meets QJ at the inn later on, he says she's only survived this long because the others have looked out for her, not because she's gone off and done her own thing. And Natsuko connects this to the way she handled things in the real world. Ultimately, it's the stoic Memorin who's able to get through to Natsuko, pointing out in a rare show of emotion that she's concerned for Natsuko's safety, but they all need to fight the Voids together. It's too big of a job for any one person to do alone. This isn't an earth-shattering approach to the theme of teamwork, but it does do a good job of setting up Natsuko for her personal growth. And it's satisfying to see her begin to open up and function as part of a team. First love. Zenshu isn't a romance per se, but it does focus heavily on the theme of first love. And interestingly, that's not just about the romantic aspect. As I mentioned, part of the main conflict of the series is that Natsuko is struggling with her latest project, which is supposed to be all about first love. But Natsuko herself has never been in love, which makes it kind of hard to make a whole movie about it. In order to explore this idea, Zenshu gives us a whole episode dedicated to the concept of first love. Part of the episode is Natsuko herself trying to figure out what it means, but a bigger part is about several people who think of her as their first love, mostly because they were inspired by her dedication to her art. The interesting thing here is that Natsuko is completely oblivious to the way others feel about her. She makes them think about things in new and different ways, but she has no idea what impact she has on them. So it makes sense that Natsuko would have no idea how to deal with her own first love. Natsuko and Luke have what is very much a he falls first romance, with him being the one having the awkward "my friend needs advice" conversations and making declarations, while Natsuko is completely clueless. That might be in part because for Luke, Natsuko is a real person who is part of his real world from the very beginning. Someone who confuses and interests him even before romantic feelings enter the picture. But for Natsuko, Luke is a childhood fictional crush, a character who inspired her art and devotion. He isn't a real person until she gets to know him beyond just the character design. And this is what makes the exploration of first love and the relationship between these two so much fun. Because sure, on the surface, the romance is pretty silly and even a little cringy. But it also digs into the idea of first love being not just about romance, but also about influence and inspiration. As many characters point out, Luke changes because of Natsuko. He's happier and goofier, which is a big deal for someone who's been raised his entire life under the pressure of needing to be a hero. A hero whose friends are slowly but surely dying around him as their battles get harder and harder. And Natsuko, who's always refused to get too involved with others, becomes increasingly aware that, while she cares about all of the 9 soldiers, she particularly wants to help Luke avoid his doomed fate of becoming the ultimate void that destroys the world. This is another theme that isn't necessarily breaking the mold, but I do think the approach is interesting. Because while the romance is cute, it also focuses on the broader concept of how the people we care about can encourage us to grow and change. Fate. Finding herself in A Tale of Perishing is kind of a weird situation for Natsuko, and I mean beyond just the weirdness of being in a fictional world. Because she knows all of these characters and she knows what's going to happen to them. At first, she accepts this with a bit of resignation. In the movie, her favorite characters die and the world ends, so that must be what's going to happen here, right? But it's different seeing fate play out in person, especially when she realizes that she can fix things by bringing her drawings to life. We'll talk more about the fixing element in a moment, but for now, let's talk about what the story says about fate. As with many stories about fantasy heroes, A Tale of Perishing involves a prophecy that says that the ultimate void will destroy the world, and only the 9 soldiers can be the true light. The prophecy is such a cornerstone of the story, Natsuko can recite it along with Elder Baobab. However, as we later learn, Baobab's prophecy isn't as hopeful as it seems at first, because she's essentially given up on the possibility of saving the world and sees fate as being impossible to change. When Natsuko reveals what she knows about Luke's fate, Baobab reveals that she's only ever seen the 9 soldiers as the world's light, in the sense that they'll provide a little bit of hope at the end so that everyone's less miserable as they die. And she's not the only one who sees fate as a bit of a downer. As an elf, Memorin has been alive for ages and is tired of seeing her friends die. She's so certain of their fate, she's joined a cult dedicated to summoning the ultimate void and ending the world sooner rather than later. When Natsuko and Luke confirm that that's her plan, Natsuko calls her selfish. In response, Memorin says that it's selfish of Natsuko to make assumptions about who Memorin is. This is a really interesting response to the theme of fate because it shows how frustrated Memorin is and also how much Natsuko thinks she knows these characters more than they know themselves just because she's seen the movie. In fact, there are a lot of things Natsuko doesn't know because real people are more than just character sheets. This includes little things like the fact that Luke likes to cook and garden, and bigger things like the real reason behind Justice's decision to stop being one of the 9 soldiers. And the more she learns about her friends, the more difficult it is for Natsuko to just accept their fate, no matter what the people around her are saying. I mean, it's pretty obvious from the beginning that the fate of the 9 soldiers is going to change on some level as soon as Natsuko shows up. As early as episode 1, she goes from accepting that things will play out the way they originally played out to preventing Yunio from sacrificing himself and finding another way to save the day. For others, fate is immutable, but for Natsuko, fate becomes something she's desperate to avoid. Fixing. The idea of fixing the story is a big theme throughout, both in terms of what Natsuko is trying to accomplish and what the people around her are trying to prevent her from accomplishing. This theme even finds its way into the title of the show. The word Zenshu is made up of the kanji zen, which means all, and the kanji shu, which means repair or fix. So the literal translation might be repair or fix all. But thematically, it's a little bit more complicated than just will Natsuko be able to fix the story and save her friends. First off, there's that fate thing. While Memorin is ultimately convinced not to bring about the end of the world and to find joy in it instead, other characters are still actively working against Natsuko. One of the most obvious is Kametaro Tsuruyama, Natsuko's animation idol and the creator of A Tale of Perishing. Natsuko learns in episode 1 that Tsuruyama has just died. And in episode 8, we learn that the weird bird that's been following Natsuko around is actually a reincarnated Tsuruyama. Tsuruyama exists primarily to warn Natsuko that even if she changes things, she'll never be able to prevent the ultimate fate of the characters in A Tale of Perishing. And initially, Tsuruyama appears to be right, because for every change Natsuko makes, there is an equal and less positive change. Natsuko prevents Yunio from sacrificing himself in the first fight against the Voids, but then Kyujei dies in order to protect her in episode 10. Natsuko helps Destiny, Luke's love interest in the original version of the story, escape her death and her forced engagement to the chairman. But even though Destiny takes charge of her own, destiny, she still ultimately ends up becoming unhappily engaged in order to protect the orphan children she's trying to look out for. And while Natsuko makes sure Yunio, Destiny, and Memorin all survive, that just means that it's Natsuko's apparent death, rather than theirs, that causes Luke to give into despair and become the ultimate void. We're clearly in Dark Night of the Soul territory here, which means it's time to do a little callback to the meta section of the story structure. Because the theme of fixing the story is built off of the idea that Natsuko is an animator and her power comes from her creativity. Ironically, the idea of fixing things is one that Natsuko actually gets from Tsuruyama. In episode 8, Tsuruyama accuses Natsuko of trying to fix or change A Tale of Perishing, which Natsuko vehemently protests. After all, this is the story that Natsuko loves, the one that inspired her to become an animator herself. She'd never want to change anything about it. But it's impossible to pretend that Natsuko hasn't already been changing things, arguably for the better, at least in terms of the character's safety and happiness. And we've already seen how she's changing the people around her. Luke, as we've already discussed, but also other characters like Destiny, who has become more than just a plot device and now lives and dresses the way she wants, thanks to Natsuko's reworking of the original plot. And like we discussed in the meta section, the big impact here comes from the fact that Natsuko is making these changes from the perspective of a creator. And that comes with all of the usual artistic insecurities and need for validation. Because while Natsuko might believe she's trying to do the right thing, she's also sometimes crippled by self-doubt, just like any other creator. For example, when Natsuko and Yunio are trapped inside of a void and assumed dead, it's Yunio's reluctant faith in her ability as an artist that breaks Natsuko free of her despair. We'll get more specific about Natsuko's final fixes in the next section, but for now I think it's interesting to note that she's trying to circumvent fate in a creative way. Thematically, this is about not being complacent and fighting for a better future no matter what the people around you say. But it's also about using your own creativity to express your love and gratitude for an original work. Natsuko makes changes to A Tale of Perishing because she loves this story and she loves these characters and wants what's best for them. It's a little bit like the mentality of a fanfic writer or a fan artist. All of these themes center around the idea of helping the characters grow while also propping up the meta-narrative about the importance of creativity. It's not that any one theme is particularly unique, it's just that they're expressed on multiple levels, which is pretty fun. Writing takeaways on themes. 1. Some of the most relatable themes in fiction involve things like relationships and personal growth. So the important thing isn't necessarily to have an amazing theme that no one's ever thought of before. It's to find ways to make whatever theme you're approaching feel relatable and relevant to your audience. What is it about the theme that you're trying to explore that will personally resonate with your readers, and how can you accentuate that? 2. Themes can play out in different ways, but they should probably be impacting more than just your MC and their growth. How are your MC's actions embodying your themes, and how does that affect the people around them? 3. What steps are your characters taking to change their world, or at least their place in it? This doesn't have to be as big a deal as saving all of humanity or changing a dire fate, but it needs to matter to your characters and the people they care about. And the steps taken need to be significant, either because they move your characters toward what they want, or because they don't, and that matters. Endings. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the end of the show, so you can go ahead and skip to the timestamp on the screen right now if you'd like to avoid that part. I would argue that in some ways the end of Zenshu is the weakest part of the writing, and I say that as someone who definitely prefers happy endings. To be clear, the issue isn't so much the tone as it is the pacing and the questions the ending leaves unanswered. Resolution. The show does do a fairly decent job of providing a certain amount of resolution. Leading up to the final battle, Natsuko and Yunio are swallowed by a void, which sets off Luke's descent into despair and transformation into the ultimate void. By the time Natsuko and Yunio manage to escape, the ultimate void has destroyed the last remaining soul future, which means both the town and the world are on their way out. Natsuko, Yunio, and Memorin try to reach Luke, but it's clear that he's not in there anymore. So Natsuko decides she's going to fix things one last time. Since Natsuko's power allows her to bring to life whatever drawing she thinks is best suited to take out the baddies, she decides to draw Luke himself. This is a resolution of sorts to the theme of first love. Natsuko's choice to draw Luke implies that she's fully accepted her feelings, both in terms of the romance and in terms of the impact he's had on her life. In her darkest hour, he's the one she turns to. Natsuko's attack is a good idea in theory, but in practice, it's not enough to keep the world from ending. However, in addition to drawing Luke, she also manages to create a new soul future, essentially a whole new ending in which everyone is alive and ready to start over. This is, of course, extremely cheesy, but it does fit in with the themes we were talking about earlier in terms of fixing things and avoiding a sort of narrow definition of fate. Once it's clear that Natsuko has saved the day in A Tale of Perishing, she returns to the real world to make better life choices about working with her team and letting others in. So we get some resolution of the personal growth angle as well. And in a very blink and you'll miss it scene right at the end, it's implied that Luke and the others might have somehow made it to the real world too. Now, even if you're a romantic like me and you love a happy ending, this ending might still leave you feeling a bit unsatisfied. Maybe because the entire epilogue takes place in about a minute and it leaves quite a bit unexplained. Explanation. I wouldn't say it's a requirement for a story to completely answer all of the questions it brings up. Open-ended endings can still be very satisfying. But there are a lot of plot and world-building questions in Zenshu that are just never addressed. For example, how did Natsuko get the power to bring her drawings to life? Who set the rules for how it works? How does her pegbar know when it's time for her to draw, and how does it even talk in the first place? How exactly did Natsuko make it into A Tale of Perishing? Did she actually die, or did she just pass out? How did she get back to the real world, and how did her coworkers react to the changes in her personality afterward? This is kind of a big thing to miss out on since it's a huge part of the initial setup, and we never really see the fallout, just a brief scene showing that she's become more of a team player. How and why is Tsuruyama in A Tale of Perishing? Why is she a bird? She does mention gaining wings, but there's no real explanation for that. Why did the voids show up in the first place, and why do they want to destroy the world? Are they meant to be some sort of symbolic manifestation of despair, or are they actual entities with some sort of overarching goal? If Luke and the others actually made it to the real world, how? I mean, I'm assuming it had to do with Yunio's horn, but it's not really clear. Wouldn't it be a problem for them to leave their own world when they're supposed to be protecting it? This feels like a situation where the pacing didn't really allow for a full epilogue that really rounded out the story. It's also tricky because some of these questions are related to world building and probably should have been answered much earlier. Things like how Natsuko's power works and why things happen the way they do in A Tale of Perishing. Other questions, like whether Luke and Natsuko will be reunited, can probably stay unanswered so that the audience can create their own scenario. Like, not clarifying feels a little manipulative, but it doesn't necessarily ruin the story. I've actually talked in other videos about how to build toward a satisfying ending that doesn't break your world building. And while some of it is subjective, I would say that the key to a good ending is to make sure you're answering all of the important questions. For Zenshu, it seems like there was a little lack of clarity in terms of what those important questions are. Would I like to have seen Natsuko and the others reuniting? Sure. But you know what I really would have liked? An ending that wasn't super rushed and actually played out the details of Natsuko's character arc. And maybe some answers to some of those questions that really ought to have been answered earlier in the story. Writing takeaways on endings. 1. A good ending is all about resolving important issues and answering important questions. Hopefully you've done some of that along the way, but the ending is the place to bring it all together. Leaving too much open can cause your audience to feel unsatisfied and frustrated. 2. That said, you don't necessarily have to resolve everything. An open-ended ending can still be satisfying as long as you wrap up the big plot points and themes of your story. 3. The key to a good ending is to come back around to the themes and character arcs you set up at the beginning of the story and show how things have changed for your characters. What you don't want to do is let plot threads or world-building details disappear, hoping your audience won't notice, because I guarantee that they will. Conclusion. So let's review what we've learned today, shall we? 1. Using a metafiction structure for your story, or just dropping in meta-references to other stories, can be a fun way to engage your audience. It allows them to actively participate by bringing their own associations to the story. This is something that your audience is probably going to do anyway, but by applying meta, you can actively encourage it. 2. That said, it's important to keep in mind that using meta is probably going to turn off some people. This is where it helps to know who your ideal audience is so you can create a story that will appeal to them even if it turns others away. 3. Classic themes like building relationships and good versus evil can seem really mundane, but that doesn't mean they're bad. It's all about how you execute those themes using your own style. And using a common theme can actually be a good way to draw in your audience with something relatable. 4. Themes are often closely tied to characters. How is your MC changing, or not changing, in response to the theme you're trying to present? This doesn't need to result in an overly obvious life lesson, but your audience does need to see that the characters are changed by the story in some way, even if the change is just doubling down on refusing to change. 5. A good ending provides resolution and answers to important questions. That doesn't necessarily mean it ties everything up in a nice little bow, but it ought to satisfy your audience in terms of coming to an understandable stopping place and providing good emotional payoff. 6. The ending is basically your opportunity to bring it all home and make choices about what you want the audience to take away. If you choose not to answer certain questions you brought up earlier, is that a conscious choice you've made because you're trying to create a specific experience? Or are you just dropping plot threads because you don't have enough time to resolve things believably? It's important to know the difference. Tangent. Okay, so I want to touch really briefly on something I've seen brought up in a lot of reviews of Zenshu, and that is the humor. Some people love it, some people hate it. The thing with comedy is, while you can certainly study ways to write it, a lot of it is still basically subjective, and I think that's really important to remember as a writer. Personally, I think Zenshu does have some funny moments related to the meta aspect, like Natsuko's comments about Yunio's death flag and QJ's convenient charging times. But there's also a lot of what I would consider cringe, like the musical sequence when one of Natsuko's drawings tries to convince Memorin not to summon the ultimate void, or a lot of the stuff about first love from episode 7. The important thing to remember here, though, is that what I might think is cringe might be completely hilarious to someone else. I bring it up because I think as writers we can sometimes get stuck in the idea of appealing to everyone and offending no one. But that's never going to work because there are always aspects of writing that are subjective. I could write what I think is the funniest scene ever, and someone else could totally hate it and think it's not funny at all. Point is, while we can and should do everything we can to improve our writing, some things are just going to be down to personal taste, and that's fine. That's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you've seen Zenshu and have any thoughts on the writing, I would love to chat in the comments. And of course, feel free to leave suggestions for other anime to cover in this series. And if you like stories about characters who go against the system to do their own thing, you might want to check out my urban fantasy trilogy, the Compound series. It is not an isekai, but it does have cranky empaths, magical conspiracies, and a bit of queer romance. Books 1 and 2 are available in ebook and paperback, and book 3 is coming out later this year. I'm very excited. More information on that is below. Thanks again for watching, keep writing, and I'll see you in the next video.